I'm glad Aggie's made it. Yep. Good morning to all of you, and you know this is a tradition we've had for years where we start the year with a convocation. We obviously couldn't do it on Thursday, but it's a moment where we reflect, and there's a kind of a sense of solemnity and excitement as we begin the year. I definitely felt that the energy in the room as the faculty came in. We feel so gifted and lucky to be here and to begin the day like this. We will begin with School Chaplain Bob Ganung offering a prayer of convocation.
Okay, let us join our hearts and minds together. Let us pray. God of mystery and presence, bless all of us here at the Taft School as we embark upon a new academic year. We pray that our campus will be a lively center for sound learning and new discovery, a place where we pursue truth, meaning, and purpose together. Grant that those who teach and those who learn may draw inspiration from you. Pour into our hearts the spirit of wisdom and understanding, spirit of counsel and spiritual strength, spirit of knowledge and imagination, the spirit of creativity and love. Remind us that Bingham is our sacred space on Tuesday and Thursday mornings. It's where we learn about ourselves and gain a greater understanding of the world around us. It's where we reflect upon what it means to be responsible, empathetic citizens in the Taft community, in our respective nations, and in the world. We give thanks for the unique qualities, the gifts, the talents, the graces that each new returning student brings to this school. Guide us as we work together over the coming year so that we find ways to intentionally and skillfully knit together a close and caring community out of our rich diversity of students, faculty, and staff. Keep us ever mindful of how privileged we are to have this kind of educational opportunity at our fingertips. Guide every one of us into a prosperous learning experience as we begin the 2015-16 academic year at Taft. Be gracious unto us, shine your face upon us, lift up your countenance upon us, and be a presence to us throughout the coming year. Amen.
So I want to talk this morning about culture, and I want to define it, and then I want to tell some stories. And this talk really began when I was talking to an alum this summer who reminded me of something that happened to him when he was here, and it reminded me of the power of stories. Now, you do a lot of things when you start a school year, clearly, but this is one of them. You create and then you transmit a school's culture, and a school's culture has a lot to do with how happy and successful each one of us is here. Now, you might wonder, some of you may have a good sense, but maybe you don't have a sense of what the word culture means. And it's a word that for educators and even people in the corporate world is a bit of a trendy noun in the last few years. It's something that many talk about. In recent months, for instance, you could have found articles in leading media, in the New York Times, for instance, about culture in high-tech companies and whether they were too ruthlessly aggressive and had workaholic cultures. Perhaps a New York Times article some of you may have seen if you read the sports section, the article last week, I think it was, on the Seattle Seahawks and the culture of that National Football League team. It's coached by Pete Carroll, and the decidedly unmacho, the decidedly loose and laid-back culture of that team, really a reflection of Pete Carroll himself. Or perhaps even closer to home, and tragically, articles that were raised in all the leading newspapers in the country about school culture at St. Paul's, a great, great school where a student rape case went to trial this summer. So what do we mean by culture? When I use that word, what does it mean? And how can a school like ours think about culture? Now, as is often the case with overused words that become threadbare from handling, I think we do well to go back and find its roots. And in this case, it's in the 15th century, and you should recognize the root here. The Latin word cultura, meaning to cultivate, meaning to till the land. And I like that image. It reminds us that culture is something that is created seasonally, and that takes hard work by everybody. By the 19th century, the word begins to be used in the way we might, and I'm quoting here from a dictionary definition, the collective customs and achievements of a people. And that's probably a pretty familiar definition for those behind me and many of you in front who know what the word means or have thought about it. And if I asked you, what does culture mean? You might give answers like, well, it is what a school or an institution cares about. It's their traditions. It's the values that are shared and are at the core. And if I asked a new student even about what characterized Taft culture, what conclusions would you draw about Taft culture even in these opening days, I think, or I certainly hope, that he or she might say after the first day of welcome, the opening day, well, it's a culture that's marked by friendliness and warmth. Or since we sign a pledge on our assignments, I guess it's a culture where honor matters a lot. And since you've heard teachers greet students as scholars, and maybe you've noticed students often thank teachers when they walk out of the classroom, you might conclude that it's a culture where learning is taken as something that's very serious. And maybe after Sunday, for those of you out there, after the zaniness of Super Sunday, you might, with students covered in paint and Crisco oil and so on, and chanting. And by the way, how were there 5 undefeated teams? But I digress. You might conclude, well, it's clearly a culture where it's cool to have fun, to be a little silly, to make an idiot of yourself, to bond with people you've never bonded with before. And all of this would be true. Now, most academics, people in schooling, would give what I would call an anthropological definition, that is a study of man, and they would say that culture means the shared values, beliefs, and norms that shape a people's behavior. It's the stuff that you have in common, if you will, and it's which binds us together. In this sense, you could argue any group has a culture. Any small group or organization could have a culture. I was at the dry cleaners downtown yesterday, Allen's, and it's a wonderful family-owned operation, and they have a culture, I think, of humor and hard work and customer service. If you go to the restaurant, the Triple Play sports bar uptown, where a lot of teams and parents go after games, you would see that there's a culture that's very family-friendly, a little bit raucous, really spirited. Athletic teams that have come back for preseason, I think, were clearly trying to create culture, the culture that leads to winning, a culture that leads to kind of unity. And they did it in lots of different ways. A trip to Europe, 3 days of camping at a nature preserve, a talent show in Lauby Auditorium, and I've heard about that, by the way, very, very interesting. Practice and locker room traditions, talks by coaches and captains, and so on. I think dormitories are in the act of creating cultures. Every dorm, every floor trying to be a safe and ordered and warm and fun place. And this happens through expectations, through the practices, through conversations by monitors. Again, corporations have cultures. If the Seahawks have a bit of a SoCal surf culture that's a reflection of Pete Carroll, and also there's team psychiatrist who is a surfer, and players are encouraged to be free, to be themselves, just be yourself is what they say at that football team. That's in stark contrast to the New England Patriots. I confess I'm a fan, but let's face it, they have a culture of paranoid secrecy, of unyielding excellence, of merciless accountability. Some argue a win-at-all-costs culture. Think of Apple. One of the great, great corporations ever created, well known for a culture that drives employees very hard, that obsesses over every single detail, that insists on creating insanely great products. Contrast that with Google, a corporation that's well known for its employee-friendly culture, a much more trusting and transparent place. Now, a slightly different definition came from a work I looked at recently called Primed to Perform, and it's a work that looks at how an understanding of human psychology can explain workplace culture. And the authors, Neil Doshi and Lindsay McGregor, define culture this way. Culture is an ecosystem of processes that increase total motivation of its people to drive performance. I like that. I think there's something for us there. The idea that at Taft we have an ecosystem of processes, our traditions, our practices, our rules, our stated values, which we hope will help motivate you and perform at a high level. So I think you can define culture in many different ways, but we probably have a shared understanding. Culture is the word that we use to describe the ideas, the principles, the behavior that are shared and valued by all. And my guess is that most of you who came, this year who came to Taft chose Taft in some way, whether you use this word or not, because of culture. Not because of the turf field or that we offered BC calculus or that there's an organ in Woodward Chapel, but because you wanted this culture. Something about it felt right. And here are the 2 most important things to remember about culture. First, culture matters a lot because it fundamentally shapes whether people in the organization are productive and happy. You cannot separate those two. That culture shapes whether we will be productive and happy. And second, remember this. Culture doesn't just happen. It can be created by each and every member and transmitted to others on and into the future. Remember, it can be cultivated. Now, the first point is obvious, obviously. It's why I think a lot about school culture. If each of you is going to be successful, and I mean really successful, be fully who you are, be able to stretch to new challenges, to be able to reach a higher level of achievement, it only will happen if our culture is a good and positive one. only if, to use that definition, the ecosystem of values and traditions and practices encourage and permits that. A culture, and we could put in all kinds of abstract nouns here, a culture of fear or dishonesty or pettiness or cruelty, disrespect, what have you, none of us can perform if that's what the culture was. But the second point is critical as well, the idea that culture can be transmitted. And it reminds us that every one of us has a role. Every one of you and everyone sitting behind me has a role in shaping culture. It's transmitted, it's passed on through traditions, through practices that we insist on, the ways we behave. It doesn't just happen, it's cultivated. And for you new students, you're learning Taft culture already, you have. You would have received this already through speeches you've heard, whether it's me or Caroline or Manny's comments on the opening day, or meetings where how we do things were explained, or from comments made by students, or from the policies and practices we have in academics and dorms and extracurriculars. So culture is transmitted like radio waves. And whether you've been here for just a week or 3 years, you're part of this. And here's, I think, how culture is most actively and effectively transmitted. I think it's transmitted through stories. Think even of your own families. Families have cultures, and families tell stories, and they become myths. And myths are stories that are filled with meaning, and they guide us, and they teach us. So I'll tell you a few stories, not only in the hopes that we reflect the best of our culture, but it also, in just the act of telling them, transmits culture. Each story has a title. They're all true. I've changed names or some small details, and most are about students. Some are about students and teachers, and the first one is actually about just teachers. Each story has a title. This one's called Just Checking on Them. When we experienced 9/11, and that tragedy, it was the first day of classes in 2001, and I hardly have to say that it was a day of excruciating confusion and fear and sadness and loss. And it was, of course, a day of enormous anxiety for new students, just as it was for 170 of you on Thursday. We had a number of faculty meetings that day to talk about what we could do to ensure students were in a good place. But it was the unscripted acts, I think, that said the most about our culture here. The next day, I found myself talking to lots of teachers, and I found myself talking to dorm teachers in particular. And I found out, as I talked to them, that without ever asking for this, without them ever coordinating, without them ever sharing this with each other, I found out that in every dorm, in every floor, faculty members were wandering the hallways well after midnight, well into the night, opening doors, checking on students, making sure they were asleep, just making sure they were okay. As one teacher told me, he said, I just felt like I wanted to check on them. And it's a story that says ours is a culture where faculty have an almost unfathomable care for all of you. Here's the next story. It's called This Teacher Thing. So a few years ago, I walked in the dining hall and I saw a postgraduate sitting alone and eating lunch. I know he had already adjusted well. Great kid. Came from a large public high school in the Midwest. And I went up and sat down and introduced myself and had lunch. And I said, so what's been the most unusual thing? What's the hardest thing for you to get used to adjust to? And I've never forgotten his words. He looked at me and said, Mr. Mack, it's this teacher thing. And I was like, oh, here we go. What is this teacher thing? And I said, well, what do you mean? He said, well, I just got my first English essay back, and I did badly. And my teacher pulled me aside, and he said, look, I'll be in my apartment tonight at 9 o'clock. Why don't you come by and see me, and we'll go over it together, and I'll give you some extra help. He said, if I did that at my old school, he'd be arrested. Right? That tells us something. I tell that story because it tells us it's funny and it's a great story, but it says something about our culture, that it's one where we cherish the relationship between students and faculty. And you see it in advisor-advisee lunches at lunch, whether it's a coach helping you after you've maybe lost a tough game, whether it's someone helping you and guide you over a very difficult moment in your life, and so on. That story affirms that relationship. Here's a story I called I Couldn't Wrap My Brain Around It. I was teaching a senior elective once. It was early in the fall, and the class came in for a full period announced open book in class writing. A very significant assessment, one we had prepared for. And some point early into the class, I left. I can't remember what for. I went to Xerox something, get a cup of coffee or what have you. I came back 10 or 15 minutes later. Students were busy scribbling away, leafing through their books, finding quotations and writing. When the bell rang, they all handed their essays in. And they looked like so many Taft essays, even in those 45 minutes or 60 minutes. 2, 3, 4 pages long, introductions, compelling thesis, use of specifics, organized prose. And Alex handed his paper in. And when I looked at it, it had about 3 or 4 sentences written, and the rest of it was blank. He had done nothing. So I asked him to wait after class, and I was disappointed, I was angry, and I said, Alex, what the heck happened here? Did you forget that we had this? Did you not do the reading? We don't do that here. And here's what he said, and I can remember almost every word. He said, Mr. Mack, when you got up and left, everybody just kept working. No one even looked up. You have to understand that at my old school, everybody cheated, and I cheated as well. And when you left, everybody kept working. He said, and I couldn't wrap my brain around that. He sat there, unable to do the English, because he was wondering, what the heck just happened? There's a word for it. It's called culture shock, isn't it? He couldn't understand. So we sat and talked, and I remember his confusion and his paralysis over the simple act of honesty that was being exhibited by all the students, and that we respect each other's property, and that we hand in work that it's our own, and that honor means everything. And we sat and talked until his brain could wrap itself around it. Here's one. It's called It's Cool to Be Smart. Years ago, I was still coaching the varsity soccer, and I'd gotten to know a very good postgraduate player from a large public high school in Connecticut. He was, I'll call him Dylan, he was a three-sport captain, straight A's, high scores, being recruited by some of the great schools in the nation. A really, really impressive kid. And during practice one day, right before practice, doing the stuff that teams normally do, kicking the balls around, stretching and talking. And some of the talk, and to be fair, not all of it, but some of it was about classes, the typical talk. Complaining about how long it took to finish a lab, how hard Scarlet Letter was, about the amount of reading in AP Euro, all that kind of conversation. And he came up to me smiling and said, Coach, I just figured it out. It's really cool to be smart at Taft, isn't it? And I said, yeah, of course it is. He said, no, you don't get it. At my old school, and this may be familiar to some of you, he said, you were either smart or you were a jock. You couldn't be both. And I was trying to be both, and no one wanted me to be both. And I hear everybody talking, and it feels it's different. So you see the story. It's a story that tells us that it's cool to be excellent and to be smart and to work hard in your classes. And we expect that, and we witness it and celebrate it. Here's a story that's entitled, That Could Be Your Sister. Rick was a three-sport captain. He was a physically tough and imposing guy. He was a senior who was universally respected at the school because he was disciplined and worked hard in everything he did. One day, as the team was stretching in the circle, I was sitting on the bench talking to the assistant coach, and at some point, the girls' cross-country team ran by, and some player made some kind of comment. I think it was probably like the kind of comment Ms. D'Onofrio referenced at assembly, not terrible, but stupid and demeaning and sophomoric and sexist, and I was furious. And I came off the bench, but before I even got to the team, Rick was standing in front of the team. And this was a big, strong, imposing, and respected guy. And I walked into the middle of his lecture, and it was something like this. That isn't happening. That's not happening here. That's wrong. I want you to think about how you'd feel if that was your sister that ran by. Got it? And guess what? My sister just began here as a lower mid. That could have been my sister. It was over. It was over. Rick, he didn't need any training. This wasn't some politically correct jargon. He just heard something that was wrong, that was classless and insensitive. It wasn't nice. He didn't like it. I don't think he thought it was a big deal, but to me it was a big deal. I thought that was an act of extraordinary leadership. He just said, I'm not going to let this go by. So you see why I share this story. I hope it's a culture where when you see something, faculty, students, all of us see something, we're willing to confront it and say, we're better than that. That's not what we do here. Here's a story called I Made It. I was very close to a young woman a number of years ago who loved team sports but was not at all athletic, and she had some significant back problems and made exercise painful, almost impossible. She came as a lower mid. She tried out for teams every season, and I don't recall her ever making a team. And in her senior year, she came up to me in the hall with a huge smile and said, Mr. Mack, I made the JV. And she said, since 7th grade, I've been cut 13 times, and I've made a team. She'd been cut 13 times. There wasn't a touch of irony. There was not a shred of pity. She just was pumped that she was going to be on that JV hockey team with a bunch of girls playing at a higher level than she'd ever played before. And even thinking of her today, I marvel at that. I'm speechless at the perseverance and courage. I don't know the grit that I don't know that I could have done what she did, to go out to practice and be reminded every day that everybody else was more agile and faster, or to wait the coach coming by the dorm room to say yet again you didn't make the team, or to worry that when she walked up to the bulletin board she'd see a list without her name. And she reminds us That it's a culture where we stick to it and we celebrate that kind of, use old-fashioned words, gumption, stick-to-itiveness, or more contemporary terms, resilience and perseverance. Now, she became a teacher. She was teaching at an all-boys school. I last heard, a school that takes its athletics really seriously, and I bet she's playing a really important part in shaping the culture and reminding people that resilience and grit is prized. This one's called Words in Chalk. I shared it with the dorm moms the other day. A few years ago on graduation morning, girls in Mac House were continuing a tradition where they write in chalk on the sidewalk as you go into graduation, Centennial Quad, notes to girls who are graduating, monitors, seniors in general. That itself, by the way, is a tradition that says a lot about Taft. And there are a lot of notes. They're written and directed to specific students who are leaving, so on. But there was one particular group that was larger. Even as other girls were scattered around, there was one larger group, maybe a dozen girls. And they were gathered closely, some of them tearful. It's an emotional day. And they were writing messages to a senior monitor who was graduating, a remarkable girl. And each was writing something. And it was as if I was watching a poem unfold in chalk underneath me, a kind of elegy, if you will. And so I asked them, I said, why are you writing? What's so special about her? And a kind of torrent of stories came out from each of them. Each of them had a story. One said that Susie had come to her room late nights early on when she is homesick, and she had never forgotten that. Another said that she had brought her to the school doctor when she was afraid to talk about her eating disorder. A third said that even though she was taking 4 APs, she still was tutoring her in math 2 nights a week for the whole winter term. Another said she didn't realize what was going on at first, but now she looks back and she realizes something was happening. She took me to dinner every Sunday night. She'd just come by my room and so on. And one girl said, when I think of what I want to become, I just want to be like her. Now, I suspect that story can be told at the end of the year about a lot of seniors, boys and girls, monitors and non-monitors, when they graduate. And it's the evidence, I think, that at our best moments, we're a culture where older students serve as leaders, as mentors, as models. They feel a kind of responsibility, a sense of being an older sibling to help younger students. This is one called, Can I Have a Crack at Him First? Early in the year, a number of years ago, I was meeting with the school monitors and asking, as I often do early in the year, is there any student you're particularly worried about? And immediately, several said, yeah, we're really worried about Jason. He's being a bully. He's being a verbal bully to kids on the floor. He's being a jerk. They use language actually more specific and vulgar than that. They said, this kid is bad news. And I heard that and I was furious. And so I found Nate, who is a 2-year monitor and a great leader, and he's on the floor. And I said, Nate, listen, that kid is coming in my office. And I'm going to read him the riot act because we will not stand for that. And he looked at me, and these are his exact words. I'll never, he said, Mr. Mack, can I have a crack at him first? I said, that's interesting. But I trusted him. And I said, okay. I said, so you've got 24 hours. If I haven't heard back from you in 24 hours, he's going to be in my office. He came by the office the next morning. Again, I remember the words. He said, and with everything he said, my anxiety went up, by the way. He said, I think we're going to be all set. And I said, well, what'd you do? He said, well, I got so-and-so and so-and-so, and one was the captain of the football team, and one was the defenseman on the hockey team. And he said, we went into his room at 10 o'clock last night, and we politely asked the roommate if he would excuse us for a minute. And I said, this does not sound good. And it got worse. He said, he was sitting in his bed, so the 3 of us pulled up chairs and we got right in his face. And I said, well, what'd you do? And he said, we went after him. We said, we don't do that here. You don't be a bully. You don't treat each other like that. And if you don't stop this, you're not going to have a friend on this campus. I said, well, what happened? He said, he started crying. He started crying. Yeah, and it's funny and then sad because this is what he said. He said, at my old school, I got picked on all the time. And I told myself here, I'm going to pick on someone else before they pick on me. Right? That kid became a monitor 2 years later. And the Mon stayed close to him. He went back the next night. He became close to him during the year. And it's just a story that tells we treat people nicely. 2 last stories. This one's called It's Not Cheap for Everyone. One night, a number of years ago, I was meeting with the school moms. It must have been the spring, because Rusty Davis and I were talking about it. He remembered the story. I think it was about bringing a band on campus for a spring concert. And the band they were talking about was some really popular band or GJ. I mean, it was like, it would have been a big-time thing. It was going to be a secret, and the monitors, the groundswell of excitement in the room about what it would feel like to bring this band, to announce that we were going to have them on campus for this price. It was going to be an amazing thing, and everyone was was excited about it, and I get that. Monitors work so hard, and the idea that they would do something that everyone would be excited about was really fervent in the room. The only problem was it was going to be expensive, and it was probably going to work out to, I don't remember the figure, but it was well over $100 a student. They're going to have to charge students $114 each or $120, whatever it was. But the consensus in the room, the excitement was impossible to push back against. Everyone wanted to have it happen. Can you imagine this? Think of the reaction. Think of how great this will be. There's a groundswell of support, and then Ann talked. And she was the kind of student who always was the last one to talk. And when she talked, everybody listened. And this is what she said. She says, my dad doesn't work. We've got some really big medical bills. My parents can't afford $100, and I'm not going to ask them. Now, it's not cheap for everyone. So if we hire the band, I just want you to know I'm not going to be able to go. And I know a lot of others won't be able to go. I'm just saying. And it was over. The monitors, the respect for her, and the empathy and understanding of the monitors said, well, forget it. If you can't go, we're not having this. They went out and got a different band. It was a $25 a person band. And I don't know that everyone realized that the reason that room was filled that day, or that concert had everyone at the school at it, was because it was a $25 and because a girl had the courage to say, I understand that this is really hard for everyone. And she had the empathy and the courage to do that. And it's a story you pass on if you believe that our culture is one about empathy and conviction. Then here's the last one. I shared this with the monitors the other day, and I confess that every time I think of this story, I have trouble getting through it because it's one that means a lot to me and it says a lot about our culture. One year I was the head of HDT2. Loved being a dorm head, just so all the dorm heads do. It's so fun to run a floor, and we had a great group on the floor, and we had an amazing group of monitors. We had a new boy that year, and I don't remember exactly when this happened. I think it was early in the year, but he's a new student. He had an older sister in college. And in a totally random act, something that was impossible to explain, she was stabbed to death in her dorm room by a mentally ill man who walked off the street. Didn't know her, completely random, utterly tragic, killed her. So he lost his sister early on in his career here. So one night in our meeting with the Mons, I said, how's he doing? We were all sitting in the living room together. How's he doing? He said, he's okay, but he's having trouble sleeping, nightmares, I said, I don't know what we can do. I can talk to him some more. Maybe we could have him sleep in the health center if that would help. I don't know. And I said, I think we're okay. I think we're going to be okay. We've got the schedule worked out. And every night, one of us goes in his room around 11 o'clock. And usually he's lying in bed, and we kind of talk to him. We dim the lights. And we kind of talk to him until he falls asleep. And then we just pull the covers over him, and we creep out. I think it's working. I think it's working. I hardly need to explain that it's a story that reminds us that this is a culture that should be most concerned and most loving and most caring for those who are most vulnerable and indeed perhaps most in pain. So we tell stories because they carry meaning, because they transmit the culture, and they carry on the values that we share. And I hope that you will be a teller and also a listener. And I hope that every teacher and student becomes part of a story that we tell years from now that holds some deep truth about our culture. And here's my point, and it's an obvious one. A school's success and its achievement and its happiness of students and faculty and staff, it cannot be separated from culture. And if culture is the shared values and practices and traditions of an organization, culture then is shaped by every single one of us in this room. Our culture is shaped by so many things. It's shaped by traditions, from Super Sunday to sit-down dinners to pledging our honor, and you can find it there. You can look to public proclamations, words etched in glass and wood and stone that tell us that our culture is rooted in service and hard work and excellence and honesty. You can look at our school's practices and our expectations and rules, from study hall to breakfast sign-in to spectating at games to major school rules. You look there to see what we value, to see what our culture is. Remember, and this is critical, culture in a school is at once fragile and sturdy. And it's created by each one of us in the room in 1,000 acts through 100 practices and scores of traditions. Remember, we cultivate culture. We till the soil of this school every year in hopes that something rare and beautiful might spring. And so every one of you in this room will be part of this cultivation. I need your help in it. I look to you to shape the culture that's being passed on such that we pass it on intact and rare and beautiful for the future. And so with that thought and with the hope that you've had a great start to the year, I welcome you to our new year. Welcome. You guys can go.